the stories that are associated with our deepest moral intuitions are pragmatic truths. And that you need pragmatic truths and you need objective truths. And you need pragmatic truths because you don't just need to know what the world's made of. You need to know what to do about the fact that the world's made out of things. And because, you know, human beings are motoric creatures, we act in the world. We act on the world. And so what we need to know is, how is it that you should act on the world? And that is not a question that can be addressed by objective methods. Technically, right? Because it's actually a value question. What should you do? Science, by its very methodology, refuses to answer such questions. And, you know, people confuse the fact that science is value-free, sort of, with the idea that existence is value-free. It's like that's philosophically primitive, I would say, because science was actually set up to get rid of the value, of the subjective value, in its technique. So you can't say, well, we set this thing up to get rid of the value, and look, all the value's gone. It's like, there's no value. It's no. You put that domain out of the range of consideration. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just a different, it requires a different philosophy, a different outlook, different techniques, different tools, different methods of proof, all of these things. And so part of what we're going to do, I'm going to use objective truth as much as I possibly can, because I think that that a lot of what psychology as a science has been able to offer in the last 100 years is actually extraordinarily useful for elucidating some of the issues that we're going to discuss. Because we really have made some progress in understanding the psyche, you know, especially at I would say at a biological / behavioral level. We've got some pretty solid information. It's not perfect, but it's helpful. Okay, so we're going to draw on a bunch of sources. We're going to draw on stories, we're going to draw on literature, we're going to draw on philosophy, we're going to draw on religion, we're going to draw on mythology, we're going to draw on biology and psychology. And there's this idea, which you should have learned about if you're a psychologist, called multi-method, multi-trait matrix. So, and this was invented by a guy back in the 1950s. I think it was Meehl and Cronbach. It's a famous paper that was published in the 50s. Everyone is supposed to know it. No one ever pays any attention to it. But what they were interested in was, how do you know if, when you say that something exists, like let's say anger, does anger exist? Well, the answer seems self-evident. Yes. Well, it's tricky, you know, because generally no one comes up to you and says anger. You know, they tell you a little story where they use words relating to anger in the story, and then you sort of derive what they mean by angry from the context. And the context is important in defining the reality, right? So you don't know if the central idea, anger, can be pulled out of the context, and then you can say, well, that's a thing, like iron is a thing, or like mercury is a thing. You know, because maybe it's not. Maybe it's a pattern, or maybe it's something that's a convention, or, you know, there may be all sorts of things that are associated with it. So one of Cronbach and Meehl's fundamental claims was that in order to determine whether or not something existed, you had to be able to detect it using different methods. Now it's tricky because it's not obvious what constitutes a different method, right? So you kind of have to make a judgment, but I would say you use a multi-method, multi-trait means of determining what's true with your senses. How many do you have? 6, because you have proprioception, right? Why? Why? Well, let's say 5 for the sake of simplicity. Why? Why not 1?
To increase the likelihood of it being true. You could see something but not be able to touch it. That might be a mirage, maybe, or
right.
Yeah. So you want multiple reasons for it to be pointing to the probability of it might be.
Yes.
True.
Well, that's exactly it, and you want it to be. So the sense idea is a really good one, because you can see that senses use different modalities, right? It's like, obviously the eyes rely on electromagnetic radiation, and the ears rely on vibrations in the air, and touch is really an atomic phenomenon in some sense, you know, because you're feeling the outer surfaces of electrons with your electron surfaces, and there's taste, which is again a molecular level phenomena, and smell, and, you know, so our idea kind of is, if if all 5 of those things detect it, it's sufficiently real so that we can use it to guide our action and we won't be wrong. So it's 5 dimensions. You need a 5-dimensional analysis. And that's evolved. So you might say, well, let's call that a good estimate. You need 5 ways of detecting something before you can be sure it's true. Now, when you're learning about experimental psychology, they tell you P is less than 0.05, right? You use a measurement and then you determine whether the probability that has manifested itself exceeds a certain level of chance. And if it does, then the thing exists. But that's actually not right. It's not right for experimental psychology, and experimental psychologists have known it since the late 50s. You have to demonstrate that the damn thing exists multiple different ways. Now, what constitutes a different way can be subject to debate. It's a complicated thing to sort out, but you can kind of figure it out, right? Maybe you use a physiological measurement and self-report or something like that, or use self-report and other report, or, and maybe you don't need 5, but you probably need 3 or something like that. A very common response from the students I've had in these courses is that I never tell anyone anything they don't already know. So, and I think the reason for that is and I'm hoping the reason is that what I'm outlining are archetypal structures. And I've drawn a lot of my work from Jung, who was very interested in archetypal structures. And so what should happen, and I think it will happen, is when I tell you a story, you'll think, oh yeah, right, that's what that means. And I see, and here's all the things that it explains. And so you'll have this sense, and that's you talked about your friend with the spiritual awakening. Often, one of the cognitive phenomena that accompanies a spiritual awakening is the connection of many, many diverse phenomena into a overarching unity. And you feel that like as a radical simplification. It's something like that, a decrease in entropy or something like that. It's a very, very powerful sensation. So, there's other sources of what you might call spiritual experience as well, but that's certainly one of them. And so you can see, I'll tell you these stories, you can think, oh, well, how does that story manifest itself in your experience? And that's a phenomenological level of truth, right? So the phenomenologists, branch of philosophy, started by Heidegger, not exactly, but let's say extended as well as anyone extended it by Heidegger. Heidegger thought that Western philosophy had gone wrong basically since the time of Socrates, which is, quite a long time. And he said that we became interested in what the world was made of and how we knew things, and what we should have been interested instead was the nature and quality of being. And what he meant by being isn't the objective world. What he meant by being was the manner in which you have experience. And so there are elements of being that aren't objective elements. And so I would say pain is a phenomenological reality, right? It's not something you can index it objectively, but the index is not the phenomena. And is your pain real? See, this is a question for people who think there's no such thing as meaning. Like, you try to argue yourself out of pain and see how far you get. You might think, well, that's not the sort of meaning I meant. It's like, a negative meaning is a place to start, right? Because if something's negative and it's real, it does imply that there's something positive that's real. It might be harder to get a hold of. At least it's not pain, but pain, Descartes, and I'll close with this, you guys can have a break. Descartes implemented a method he called radical doubt when he went on his philosophical journey. And what Descartes looked for was one thing he couldn't doubt, because he was probably clinically depressed, and he was just doubting everything. It's like, well, how do I know the world isn't just a mirage made by an evil demon to obfuscate reality from me? Well, his conclusion was the one thing that he could not dispute was that he was and could think. Now, I don't think Descartes really meant what we meant by think. I think he meant more what we would mean by experience. Because thought has become a much more narrowly defined term since the time of Descartes. So I don't think he meant I think, therefore I am. I think he meant something like I experience. I have experience, therefore I am. But regardless of that, modern people think about it as thought. Heidegger was different. Heidegger basically said the one thing you can't dispute is that experience is your experience. It exists. You can't, it's almost by definition, right? It's like the definition of exist. And then he was interested in what the fundamental elements of existence were. And they're not atoms, like, you know, like the fundamental elements of the objective world. They're more things like pain. And for me, that was the thing that stopped me from doubting. It's like, I cannot doubt the existence of pain. It seems real. And I might say it seems more real than anything else. Now, you might say you don't believe that, but I would say, I don't care what you think you believe. I'll watch you when you're in pain. And every single one of your actions will indicate that you believe in it. And not only that, that you can't not believe in it. Right? It's there, and it's there so much that, well, that's a meaning. And so that it's in that way that Heidegger, at least in part, thought of existence as, or experience as, composed of meanings. And so part of the reason that this course is called Maps of Meaning is because one of the things we're going to look at is the structure of meaning. And we're going to start with negative meaning because, from my perspective, it's, look, you can doubt whether or not good exists. But once I'm done telling you about the things I know about human history, there won't be a single person in this room who thinks that evil doesn't exist. And you might think that's a bloody horrible thing to learn, but it's not. It's unbelievably useful because once you can establish something that you cannot deny, then you can move from that. And I think you can hypothesize that if you're capable of detecting radical evil, I'll tell you about Unit 731 at some point, or you can look them up yourself. I wouldn't recommend it, by the way. Once you can identify radical evil, and you think, well, that's just, beyond a doubt, that's reprehensible. There's no justification for that whatsoever, no matter what, whenever. Well, then you've got something to stand on. And you can start thinking, well, what's the absolute opposite of that then? You know, it might be, how is it that you could conduct yourself so that in your sphere of influence, the probability that anything like that would ever happen is reduced to the absolute maximum? Well, that's a reasonable moral question. And I don't think it's something that you can dispense with like a casual nihilism. I don't think a nihilist can dispense with it. Because even nihilists suffer. Thank God for that. You know, it's their only source of potential salvation. Sometimes they notice it. Oh, I'm suffering about all this nihilism. Maybe that indicates that there's something flawed in it. It's always possible.